very happy to welcome to our crowd tonight about 45 students who are seniors in high school in Indianapolis who are visiting the school and have been here this afternoon and this evening, and also the members of the Indianapolis chapter of the AIA who have come along with them. I would like to announce that our college soccer team is now in the finals, and that the final game between the dormitories and the independents is coming up Wednesday afternoon at either 4:30 or 5 o'clock. And this we won't know until Wednesday at 4:30 probably. Are you sure? 4:15 seems to be the latest word, but it's Wednesday afternoon. The next game after that will be the final game and the championship. So far, our team is undefeated, which I think is quite fine. I think a hand is in order. Although we do a heck of a lot of living in this building, we do not classify as a dormitory. Our speaker tonight has had the opportunity to be with some thesis students last night. He and I both had the opportunity to get down to Columbus this morning to look at a little architecture down there. He's a guy I met riding around Sarasota, Florida on a bus in 1956. We were on the Southeastern Atlantic AIA convention, and we were going around looking at two architects' work. We were looking at Paul Rudolph's work. Paul Rudolph was practicing in Florida at that time, and also we were looking at Vic Lundy's work. Especially, I remember a very fine church there. And I think I might tell you just a little bit about what this man had done before 1956. He'd served 3 years with Patton's troops in Europe. He had he'd gotten an engineering degree when he was in the Army. He had then attended Harvard as an undergraduate student and a graduate student. He had practiced in Florida. He'd won one of the PA Design Awards. He'd won a national award from the AIA. He had been a Roach Traveling Scholar, which is one of the finest traveling scholarships you can win. Since that time, he has done work all over the country and outside the country. His work has been exhibited in Moscow, in Tokyo, in every major architectural exhibition we've had. He's represented the Architects of America on a tour of 4 architects to Russia. It would be impossible to list all his achievements. I'm sure he will tonight list a lot of his buildings and show a lot of his buildings. I think it'll be a very interesting thing for all of us to see his developing philosophy of architecture, and I can assure you after being with him 24 hours that his philosophy of architecture is not a set thing, but is a changing thing. I'd like to introduce Victor Lundy, who's a fellow in the American Institute of Architects. Vic?
After that introduction, there's nothing left to do but to die or maybe to run for president. I'm not a professional teacher. I've served as a visiting critic to some of the universities, and you'll have to, I'm a notoriously slow starter, but a very strong finisher, and you'll probably have to turn me off at the end. I hope that what I can bring to you tonight is a sense of real possibility and hope about your own bag, and what and perhaps extract from my own revelations about my wonderings and some of the searches I've been through, and use them. What I can tell you is my conviction in the areas in which I feel confident. I believe in architecture ultimately as a great art, like music, like painting, like sculpture. I paint and I sculpt myself, usually when I don't have any other work to do. And I found that it saves my life. And I don't say this frivolously, because I realize it's an unpopular view to hold in these times. But these times, or times similar to these, have been with us before. And I see a tremendous hope in an alliance more and more between, say, people of my own generation. I'll be 50 in February, and young people coming up. Between organizations like the UDC, I'm very happy that they've finally given me a project in New York. I think Edward Logue is one of the great sponsors of good contemporary architecture in our country today. They've done a marvelous job in Boston. Now they're in New York. And what is interesting is the number of young people he has in his offices. They're all, I would imagine, your age. And I'm sort of tired of my own generation, mainly because I've got two wives about my age always harassing me about money. It's sort of a vivid experience of what's coming. And I think at the same time, there are sort of, there's the tyranny of the layers of scrutiny that work over creative architecture today, I think, in this country. Unless you are fortunate enough to have a marvelous client who chooses you because he wants the best your creativity can produce, that's a rather rare situation. Most jobs are perhaps for public agencies that choose you for competence and good design, but there are people lying in wait, and I've learned to use my own judgment and my own vision, to trust my own sense about things, and to challenge cliches. For example, it's so easy to say, we talk about systems in architecture today, and I think the truth is that there are no prerogative to this term systems. I think all good contemporary architects who are practicing today, just by the nature of the profession, use systems. I know that I'm in New York. One of the reasons I'm there, I think some of the best consulting engineering firms in the world are there. I work with marvelous structural engineers, with mechanical engineers. When we sit down to discuss a building and have a talk out at the beginning of something, it isn't you know, a magic sketch that's sort of handed to them. It's an integrated effort. It has to be, or you can never get close to the budget or fulfill all of the expectations made on you. But what I have seen in the last 10 years is that our world of building is getting so overburdened with choices that are possible to a client that it certainly, that the artist, the true artist, is really slowly sinking, and you have to be one of the best in the world, I think, to survive. People care less and less about a creative person expressing himself. They have the choice of every architect in the country. They have the choice of people with special labels that seduce them with terms like systems and turnkey and maintenance-free and leak-proof and all the rest. And not that that isn't a responsibility of all of us. What I hope to bring you, and I mean this, is through being completely candid about my own life experience, what I've been through, and perhaps show you what I'm into today, is a real sense of hope. I think I was just talking with Charlie and some of the faculty about how come our system seems to produce this yearning in every individual to be a unique artistic genius. I mean, we really push this design thing, even though not everyone is a designer. And I think one of the great flaws of practice is this desperate search always in good architectural firms to find competent people who are designers but know how a building fits together, works together. But maybe that's an expression of our, well, it is an expression of our country. I mean, it's sort of the ultimate thing. And maybe it also says that, what I believe, that art goes on. It saves your life. And I think in the history of all of the arts, in painting, in music, in sculpture, in architecture, there is really a continuous thread that starts from the past and goes on through the present into the future. And very few people ultimately are on that path. When all the smoke clears and all the tumult dies and the magazines decay, there are really just a handful of great buildings in the world that have meaning, I think, for all people. And I think I've thought of maybe a definition of what art really is, and that the true artist somehow says it for the whole human race. He, through his perception, through his vision, through his struggles, with an architect it may be just, one building. Quantity isn't necessarily it. I say that because I don't have much quantity. But to make a perfect thing, for me, is the ultimate goal. That doesn't mean I don't have social consciousness. I do, because I've martyred maybe 1/4 of my life doing impossible jobs in ghetto neighborhoods where I didn't get paid or contributed my own money to it. But I had to secretly admit that it wasn't especially interested in helping the people. It was to get another building up. I'd like to read, perhaps some of you have read Solzhenitsyn's Nobel speech. I just saw it the other day, and I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs which I think have been said beautifully by a great writer, which which I think sort of capture the essence of this. He says, "One artist imagines himself the creator of an independent spiritual world and takes on his shoulders the act of creation of that world, of its population, assuming total responsibility for it. But he stumbles and breaks down because there is no mortal genius capable of bearing such a load. Just like man, who once declared himself the center of all existence and was incapable of creating a balanced spiritual system. And then, when failure occurs, it is all blamed on the eternal disharmony of the world, on the complexity of the contemporary shattered soul, or the stupidity of the public. Another artist realizes that there is a supreme force above him and works gladly away as a small apprentice beneath God's heaven, even though his responsibility for everything he writes or draws and for the souls which perceive it is all the more severe. But still, it was not he who created this world, nor is it he who provides it with direction, and he has no doubts of its foundations. The artist is only given to sense more keenly than others the harmony of the world and all the beauty and savagery of the human contribution to it, and to communicate this poignantly to people. And even in the midst of failures and down at the very lower depths of existence, in poverty, prison, illness, the sensation of a stable harmony will never leave him. However, all of the irrationality of art, its blinding twists and turns, its unpredictability, its unpredictable discoveries, its soul-shaking impact on people, are too magical to be contained within the world outlook of an artist by his conception or by the work of his unworthy fingers. Archaeologists have not yet discovered any stage of human existence without art. Even in the half-light before the dawn of humanity, we received this gift from hands we did not manage to discern. Nor did we manage to ask, why was this gift given us, and what are we to do with it? And all those prophets who are predicting that art is disintegrating, that it has used up all its forms, that it is dying, are mistaken. We are the ones who shall die, and art will remain. And the question is whether before we perish, we will understand all its aspects and all its ends. Not all can be given names. Some of them go beyond words. Art opens even the chilled, darkened heart to high spiritual experience. By the instrumentality of art, sometimes we are given, vaguely, briefly, insights which logical processes of thought cannot attain. Like the tiny mirror of the fairy tale, you look into it and you see, not yourself, but for one fleeting moment, the unattainable to which you cannot leap or fly. And I'd like to add to that never forget for a minute what a deadly serious and responsible act it is to make a work of architecture. We live in an age where it's getting harder and harder to be innocent and to look at things in a simple, beautiful way. The minute things are off the boards, they're published. We have access to every creative idea 1 month after it's executed, no matter where in the world. There are frivolous ideas which in a way are based on saying that art, quotation marks, art has to express its age, and then they sort of copy all the chaos and the visceral quality of our age. That is not art. With that as an introduction, I'd like to sort of go back to the beginnings of my things and hope you can extract something out of it. Okay. Just, I thought I would put this slide at the very start. These were some rocks I saw with a friend outside of Moab, Utah, and last year in the spring, to keep myself honest, I went down the Colorado and the Grand Canyon in a small rubber raft with a bunch of friends, and I must say, even with, I think I have a world sense of architecture. I've been to India 3 times, and I think to see just the pure, mysterious sculpture that nature has wrought makes almost every form that man has created, with all his justifications, sort of pale, and also the big sense of it. I have never seen, visually, I've never seen cities in the world that man has made that equal the visual impact, I think, of some of these accidents of time and nature. And I think in that sense, there's hope for us all. You aren't competing with somebody in Muncie or with the Eastern establishment. I think you aren't competing with anyone. You're part of the human race and part of all the history of man that has gone before. And your heritage is Angkor Wat and the Hagia Sophia and the Parthenon and all these peaks of human endeavor. And I think our time is just starting. And Charlie made me aware today that when you people are my age or even younger, it will already be the year 2000. That's sort of an incredible thought. And you're the ones who will be making things then. Wilbur, do I squeeze this for the small? Okay. Why don't you just keep showing the large ones? Just hold that for just a minute. This was the very first little building that I did in my own practice. It was a small church in Sarasota, Florida, and the entire thing. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of it. They were lost. It was built for $50,000. A small country church. That was the second building. It was in Venice, Florida, and Fellowship Hall, set in the woods. These buildings, in my case, came almost as a rebellion and explosion from the austerity of the Bauhaus system. I had my master's at Harvard, and I found in my own case that it almost completely destroyed me. And even though Gropius was a great teacher, and I think often the purpose of school is to cause reactions like that in people, to make you wonder to the point of quitting, but never quit. And in my case, I think it was this traveling fellowship I had, the Roach Traveling Fellowship, which allowed me 18 months in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, where I finally stopped looking at contemporary architecture and spent all my days doing paintings, watercolors. That I came back sort of with the blackboard wiped clean. And as a matter of fact, I find myself in that kind of situation right now. Why not just flick through some of the big ones? These are all laminated wood churches that I did, all with rather low budgets. On the right, I used a giant brick that was sort of L-shaped, and I arranged it in a crisscross pattern, and that left voids in 2 directions, which we filled with this colored glass. Hold this one on the left. At a certain point, doing these early buildings, I got sort of carried away with virtuosity using laminated beams. And here on the left, this is sort of an ultimate of what not to do. I thought where I made a building that sort of looked like a tropical flower. And you don't design a pickle factory in the form of a pickle. And I think the best of those early buildings was this St. Paul's Church. that you see on the right. That's in Sarasota, Florida. Again, it had a very modest budget, just $80,000. And there are compromises in its structure. Here, you see it again. I wanted the structural system really to span from the perimeter beams, but there are really steel columns along the glass line. Hold this one on the left, please. What was interesting was that by sort of being inspired by the Gothic cross vaults, the structure was actually rather inexpensive. Compared to parallel bents, which would have had to be 7 inches wide, these were only 5 1/4 inches wide, and they were spaced so the maximum span of this heavy double tongue and groove decking was 16 feet. And I think very early I learned a secret that has been true for me in my architecture all my life, and that is the beauty of structure and of allowing the naked structure to form the final visual thing. And I don't think I've ever covered a beam up, and that carries with it great responsibility and problems. For example, in contemporary office buildings, there are acoustic ramifications, and you have to solve those and be responsible. But this part, I think, I had a feeling for very early. I was called back. I'll show you other pictures later on when I got sort of bored with doing laminated wood beams. And as a matter of fact, Timber Structures in Portland, Oregon, the biggest producer, the ones who did these, went out of business last year. I hope it wasn't because I stopped using these things. Maybe we can get back to this later, but I wanted you to see the comparison of the two forms, and I was sort of interested in trying something different. And I sort of achieved this form, which was done in a rather arbitrary, sculptural, artificial way in the early building. I let it happen through the truth of the structure on the left. The building on the left is a much purer work of architecture. It's upside down. The white stone, you may have noticed, is a stone, it's coral, it's called coquina, and it's quarried off the coast, the east coast of Florida. It's calcified marine life. Very, very beautiful. Could you keep going with the enlargement, please? Why don't we just keep running through the... This is a small country club pavilion in Orlando, Florida. Also not too expensive. This was a small motel at War Mineral Springs. I sort of got carried... Hold this for a sec. What was interesting was there was a certain innocence to that whole area at that time, and it was really fun to practice architecture there. This was done by a small country builder who had never built anything over a $40,000 house. And the engineering, of course, was sophisticated. These were about 14-foot, 6 square hyperbolic paraboloids, just 2.5 inches thick. And those were cast on the ground in plywood forms, which he made himself, and hoisted into place over columns which were work in the country, and the climate permits it, and the beautiful white sand they have there permits it. Okay, just on the right is the cable structure that was done just 2 years ago. Why not hold these on the left, and I'll just... On the right are a number of buildings that I did when I first started practice. I think it's really a truth in the lives of most creative people that there's an early time of discovery where everything goes right. And part of the going right is that everyone loves to discover newness and talent, and they sort of rejoice in it. So you can sort of expect that in your own careers. Then there's a middle period of heavy suffering, which I've just gotten out of, where, you know, they say, okay, big deal, and then you join the ranks of, you know, 20,000 other geniuses who you compete with, and I think it's that middle period where things have to really come together into a philosophy that's beyond just you know, spontaneous outbursts. And I really hope that my best work starts now. That was Florida Silver Springs on the right, and it was amazing how I got jobs then. I got that job because they were interviewing architects from all over the place, and I got that because I was an infantry sergeant in Patton's army. The owner had been in the first division, and we talked the same language, and I ended up with a commission. It was incredible. It isn't much, but it was big. There were a number of buildings when I in Sarasota where I played with form and sort of experimented in many different things. But somehow the wood things I was most at home with, and I guess I still am. That's something I would have denied a few years ago, because I tried to sort of join all the current cliches in order to get work. Also, there's the fact of locking yourself into a specialized thing. It's rather obvious that to be a wood architect, you know, exclusively means that you can never do large buildings. Our building codes forbid it. You can't do multi-story buildings. But there's no reason why a real understanding of that material can't be a real part of your palette. That's another one of the. That's in Dunedin, Florida. All of those early churches were built for none of them over $80,000. Then I left the land of sun and I came north. On the left is a school that I did in Westport, Connecticut, the Hills Point Elementary School, which is really a one giant space which sort of domes up in the interior. Could you flick those, please? I don't have very good pictures of that one. But everything was wood, everything was warm. Let's hold it on the left. On the right was another building that was a furniture store in Sarasota. I made a flower out of redwood, and by this time I think I had learned to detail in a pretty competent way. One thing I've learned that I think almost all architects have to face in our sort of visceral, frantic U.S. way is how so much good architecture gets destroyed. I've come back since, and this building has passed through 2 owners, and the last owner, this was just a glass pavilion. Maybe I have pictures which give you it was a very pure, simple thing. And what he did, he took out every alternate panel and made it vertical redwood. And the last guy has painted the overhangs alternately in orange and white. So, now how are we going to work these 2 sides together? Why don't I work on the right-hand side? That building was inspired by my second wife lying on her side on the beach. It's a model of an air-supported structure that we did for the Atomic Energy Commission. This was about, gosh, eight or 9 years ago. And I think it's one of the most exciting things I've ever done. And very few people in this country know about it or have seen it. But every time I meet a South American, they remember it because it traveled, and I traveled with it to Rio de Janeiro, to Montevideo, to Bogota, to Argentina, Buenos Aires, and it's a real Latin building. And it was about over 300 feet long, and a double-skinned air-inflated structure to house a traveling exhibit showing the peaceful uses of atomic energy. And what's interesting is that model was something that I work a lot in clay as a sculptor, and I sort of discussed with experts in fabric and some of these air structure people who discouraged any true sculptural form other than a pure bubble. The air structure, left to its own devices, just wants to be a big, dull, old brown globe. And the question I asked, and the thing I think we proved in this building was, why not, within the restraints of fabric strengths, stitching, and all of the rules they work by, make a malleable, real piece of architecture? And this was done. It only cost $100,000, just a little over $4 a square foot. And as a matter of fact, it still exists. This building traveled all through South America, and then they reconditioned it and sent it to Ireland. And I almost fell out of my movie seat one day when I saw this thing in the movie Ulysses. There it was. And strangely enough, they used it erotically to symbolize a woman. I didn't realize what it was when I did it. I still don't. Anyway, you entered one end through revolving doors, and there was an auditorium where they showed a quick film, and you walked through these great vaulted spaces to the center dome where there was a working nuclear reactor. And there it is in Buenos Aires. It was put up in about 18 hours. They called it El Globo, the worm. But I think, as you can see, there are marvelous sculptural forms that one can use. For example, these inner things were just made like joined salamis stitched together. They're all inflated, and that's just a beautiful arch, I think. And then inside there was a double fabric, separated, compartmented, 4 feet apart with air pressure in between, and also blowers that keep the inside inflated. And I think it's a rather interesting concept, architecture that can go up and down and moved in boxes, about as big square as that blackboard. Let's see now. When I came north, this was a project, and I threw these in to show you. I work in clay a lot, and speaking with the students yesterday, I sort of suggested that. I think it's very easy to be locked into what you finally evolve your architecture into by how you make your models. And I think for a while, even Louis Kahn's architecture, I remember his buildings looked like cardboard with cutouts. And I think clay is a marvelous medium because you can cut away, you can scoop out, you can stuff back in, you can, it's just very unprecious. And I was never able, this is a plan view of it, I was never able actually to get that building, I think, as good as this model. The idea of this, a Unitarian church in Hartford, was that the sanctuary was in the middle, and there were compartments around it of different sizes that housed different rooms, meeting rooms and classrooms and so on. And I'll show this to you later. That's one picture of it. Now could you go to these? This was these slides perhaps illustrate why I find a real excitement working in New York. Everybody talks about the clanging together of races and the problems and all this sort of thing, but it's, I think, part of our cities today, part of our world today, and New York is certainly where it's at. And this was a small church that I did for the East Harlem Protestant parish. Just hold it one moment. And the site was stuffed in one of the worst blocks in New York City, in East Harlem. You could see the beauty of the given conditions. I mean, there were old refrigerators, parts of dismembered corpses. People, I mean, threw everything out the window, junkies living in the neighborhood buildings. It was pretty wild. Although in all the time I've walked the streets of New York, I've never been mugged. Maybe it's that old, dirty, filthy trench coat I wear. They probably think I'm a mugger. But it was an interesting problem, and I think a very nice thing only when it was finished. And if you go there now, the whole idea was to help influence some of the buildings around it, and that sort of tight open spaces around it, I think, were part of it, to make it part of the street. And when the tenements were torn down, much to my surprise, I wasn't hired to help in that. And what's there now is pretty ghastly. In a way, I prefer the old slums if they had been reconditioned. I think that's a real lesson. Some of these marvelous old buildings, even though they're full of decay, when you think of the value that's in just those brick walls, what it would take to replace them, and the relatively small amount it takes to recondition these old buildings that at least preserve the facade and the sculptural truth of a street in an urban city. I mean, actually, some of these old New York blocks are rather beautiful with their rather common facades, cornice lines that go through. It's a heavy vernacular, but it's better than this kind of hysteria of different stuff. Also, this building has gone the route of most buildings which are built in neighborhoods like this, which are a symbol to attack and destroy. It's just covered with graffiti, and it can never be brought back. They poured machine oil over the brick. It's pretty unbelievable. Why not flick through these, please? There's the interior. Oh, better hold it on the left, sorry. But I have never, in my own practice, been spoiled. I mean, I'm 50 years old, and I think I'm capable of doing maybe 50% more work than I have the chance to do. And I think just criticizing my own efforts, until maybe just the last few years, I've had a tendency always to do more than the problem demanded. You know, to make an individual statement that just sort of spoke too loud. But on the other hand, why not? I think it would be a dull world if there weren't individuals, doing their thing, expressing themselves, and hopefully making beauty. That church in East Harlem was built for $200,000, which these days is almost a house budget. Of course, I helped it along by not charging anything for my own fee. And I still owe my structural engineers their fee. For a small building, I think those of you who visited I think it was the first sort of serious attempt I made to cope with the handling of light in a building. And, you know, how do you let the light in? In the earlier buildings, I would decide what to do in a day. A roof hovering over glass, period, you know. And even though in hot Florida, full of glare that presented all kinds of problems. And I think how you let the light in is one of the big miracles of architecture. When to let it in, when to extrude it out, I notice that some of the students are sort of aware of that. In this building, light came in at the entry point, and then in this very tiny building, the black people and the Puerto Ricans in this horrible, dumb street wanted an experience in their little church, and they kept talking about going up to it. So I let them walk up a small mountain, and to get to the sanctuary, you go up this ramp. This is in the auditorium space. And this cross was made by picking up 2 old pieces of lumber on the site and just hooking them together. Okay, on the left is the Hartford church, which is interesting, I think, structural idea with the radial, it was my first experiment with reinforced concrete, and I knew nothing about architectural concrete, which is, it had, the art of doing it and making it is still very difficult. And even today in Columbus, I saw unsuccessful examples of that. But I think the trick, just so you know, in architectural concrete is to recognize that it's never done at once. And you have to think in a way in reverse. What makes the truth of the concrete is the form. So if you want a slick, smooth surface, you use overlaid plastic plywood forms. You have to, in your architectural details, if you want a superb job, you have to draw the joint lines. You have to recognize where the horizontal pour lines will be, and you make an event of them. To ignore them or to try to make a continuous monolithic thing is impossible and leads to flaws, while purposeful lines in the concrete are controllable, and you never really notice them. They're part of the truth of the material. And there are marvelous finishes like bush hammering, which gets into a science of light bush hammering, heavy bush hammering, your choice of aggregate in the concrete, which is revealed by the bush hammer. And I've just discovered something on my tax court building, the big one up there on the right, that I overlooked, and that my structural engineers, separate associates in New York, overlooked. You have to gap grade the aggregate if you want enough of it to show in the bush hammering. And it's architecture is an intense, never-ending battle of expertise. It's not for amateurs, and And also the sad truth of how the profession is developing, it's inevitable, I think. The small firms throughout this country seem to be getting gobbled up by the big ones. And clients these days, given the choice of large firms with their built-in departments of specialty in spec writing, in cost estimating, in engineering, in detailed know-how, it's sort of hard for a small office to compete with that. I've made up my mind. I'm determined to have a bigger office, but never so big that I can't personally sort of do what I feel I was put on earth to do. If I had to give up control of design, I would rather be a sculptor or do something else. Why not go through, leave the ones on the right, and just, now let's get to the big ones all the way. This was my first experience with cables, and these gentle curves you see were achieved by just letting cables hang in catenary curves, in concentric catenary curves from the concrete supporting pillars. Here you see. Here you also see the unsuccessful concrete work. Here you see the ring that supports it all. And this was a sort of a lovely thing that happened in the winter. Just hold it for 1 minute. Once again, in this building, everything is naked. Everything is shown, and this is a perfect example of biting off more than you can chew. I had 3 guys in my office and myself, and for us to attempt a building like this without any experimental, actual size models was incredible, because everything was an invention, really. You know, how you keep water out when the wood hits those vertical concrete fins. What do you put on the roof surface of a live roof that dances on cables, and the roof being wood, which is another live material. But that was a truth we discovered, that wood and the cable go well together. We had a serrated pattern to the underside of the wood for acoustic reasons, and that seemed to work. Then we discovered detailing this thing. I had all the partitions not go up to the ceiling, but to make closures for sound, you couldn't possibly use glass. Also, so we used plexiglass, which I don't think I'll ever use again, because the first dumb janitor you get who runs his greasy rag over the thing full of pebbles or something scratches it forever. Then also we had to hang the plexiglass from the roof, and we realized that when the roof deflects as much as 2-3 inches, the vertical joints open at the bottom. And how do you do that? But we did it. And it cost about $500,000, but I don't go there anymore, because when I do, they really chew me out. Maybe if I die in a fiery crash, they'll love me again. I've tried to do that too, but you can't die in a red Volkswagen bus somehow. It doesn't go fast enough. Oh, I didn't mean to touch that. I'm sorry. Keep going on these. This was my first big company job for the IBM Corporation in Cranford, New Jersey. And I think you can see how I was, influenced by my experiences in wood, and lots of architects laughed and laughed, but somehow now I go back to that thing, and I'm really glad it's there. This building is still a real solid presence when you go by it on the highway. These are a concrete brick, and the way we were able to get these up with this incredibly stupid New Jersey labor there's no state as dumb as New Jersey. No matter how you explained it, how you did it, they got it wrong. You'd better hold it there. And I just want to say that to get those patterns, what we finally did was detail in the drawings, I forget, the 4 or 5 patterns, and in wood, edged in aluminum, and the masons would just be numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. And for each course, the mason would just lay the template down and just push these things in until they hit the back unthinkingly, and this resulted. And I think these flowers in concrete were sort of an achievement, I must say, because they were done in fiberglass, and there was an original wooden mock-up that was made for these, and I wish I had gotten that, because it was an incredible piece of sculpture. And what I learned very quickly again was that in concrete you can't think in terms as delicate as these. However, it would be sort of interesting to me about 2,000 years from now, because this thing will last forever. It's got enough steel and concrete in it for that. It'd be interesting when these fragments are discovered, you know, what they think or where this came from. I don't know where it came from myself, because I was conceived in either Istanbul, Turkey, or Athens, Greece, or Central Park. Okay. Now, this building I throw in here because, stark and simple, it begins to represent. When I pull back to the one before, I'm sorry. This may be of interest to you, but for the last 10 years, I've really paid attention. I've finally become a responsible architect, and it's taken this long to face the issues of detailing forever, so that a building is faultless, and it's a responsible act, and it takes away from other things. I wanted to illustrate this point of the horizontal joints. The concrete was poured up to a horizontal line. Those tie holes that you see, we detailed the location of every one. They were all dimensioned, and in our specifications we called for exact shop drawings of all of the formwork detail. And that's the simple secret of it. And this building was done by a rather small contractor in Sarasota, Florida. And it was finished a couple of years ago. And the budget for this building was $300,000. Slide, next one, please. Here you see the cables which hang from a long light steelwork truss which spans the long dimension. There's that horizontal joint in concrete, and that little bead is achieved by beveling the edges of the form boards. This reflection is I put the camera on a polished altar piece of stone. There you see one end of this light steelwork truss. The cables are spaced every 16 feet, which is the maximum span for single lengths of the double tongue and groove decking, and that's it. And when in place, this was erected, the cables were put up, hanging there, and the carpenters started from the bottom and just worked their way up, climbing up this thing. And by the time it was all nailed together with big 7-inch spikes, it's like the hull of a boat. And this acts like a great beam. This is a building which hasn't been published, and we're still sort of finishing it up. It's a chapel in Tallahassee, Florida. The budget for this was about $400,000. And once again, more really than I've realized that this is a flaw in my work. I tried for more than the budget could stand. The building is worth $1 million. And both the contractor and I sort of went broke doing it, but still, it's worth it. You know, it's up and stands. I liked it so well inside that I tried to talk them out of the pews we had designed in walnut for this place. It seemed to me that it was beautiful just having the concrete sculptured seats and the ceiling covered with carpeting. This is a small, a very responsible little building. I was determined to do something with a sort of rediscover the box. And the budget for this building, again, is somewhere between $300,000 $400,000, and it is a small education building for St. Bernard School in Gladstone, New Jersey. Henry Luce III picked me to do it, and I wanted to make damn sure it didn't leak or have any flaws. And also, I wanted it to sit very quietly in that landscape. And I think it's a very, I learned in this building about, you know, not making everything sort of shout and make too much noise. It's very quiet, very serene, and it really sits there. The brick is gray, sort of the color of the bark of the trees. And the idea of the building is that instead of glopping it all together into something that would have been out of scale with the other little buildings on this campus, I broke it apart and I let the open court run through. And these buildings are linked under the ground. At the end, there's a staircase that goes underneath this on the right, which is the library. And once again, I've taken all these pictures, and some of them don't really, they aren't exposed correctly, but I think there's a real nice quality to the light. Instead of having great big windows which look out on trees, which engulfs these people every time they step outside, I made the classroom opposite that. I made it a place where you sort of come into a place which every classroom has windows and a skylight along which washes the wall opposite where you enter, like that. I mean, you don't, and the windows are openable. And then once again, these bearing walls were close enough, the brick bearing walls, and the wood always used the walls to sit on, and was left alone. This is sort of looking up the library front wall. Sort of an interesting truss up at the ceiling. This room is about 45 feet square, and there on the right you see the semicircular stairway to a lecture hall below. This is back to the Wesley Chapel in Tallahassee. The concrete work on this wasn't as good as the one in Sarasota. This is inside, I don't know if any of you were to the New York World's Fair, the recent one. And I did some of the air structures over the brass rail restaurants. My great commission at the fair was doing the toilets and the hot dog stands at the New York World's Fair. And I must say, they were the most miserable, asinine client I've ever had in my life. And there were supposed to be 30 of these things, and they were supposed to be, you know, very quiet, cheap, nothing things. And I surprised them by coming up with this concept of, you know, why not make the toilets the biggest thing at the fair? If you gotta go, you can find them easily. And each one of these towered up to about 75 feet and was about 65 feet in diameter. And the whole business cost about $12,000. And even so, they and this is getting inside this thing. It was really incredible. We were jumping off the platform into this thing, standing on air and bouncing up and down. It was wild. And why can't architecture have a roof like this, which is made of fabric that thin? The artistry is in the stitching. And actually, I have to confess once again that once I knew what I wanted to do, what I thought of was to have a balloon and then just constrain it with wires and so on. And I made a sculpture in clay to show what I wanted. And then we got into the engineering. But the last I heard, when the fair was, disassembled, many things on the World's Fair ended up in strange, exotic places. Just last week, I saw some of the lights in the World's Fair in some little country place in Pennsylvania. And I understand that these were bought for some African university. And I've always wondered what they did with that. Okay. This is about the toughest project I've ever done. This is a drawing that I did for the, it's an intermediate school for the New York Board of Education in a very tough neighborhood full of interracial tensions. It just sort of couldn't be worse, near Kennedy Airport. And it's the largest project I've done. And I wish I had finished pictures of it. It will be opened February, about February 1st. This was a view from an adjoining rooftop, an apartment house looking down. But this is, these are some pictures that give you some flavor of it. On the outside, hold this one for just a minute. On the outside, it has to be pretty opaque. That is, if you had glass outside, it would be broken literally in one day. Everybody's angry at everybody else. It used to be an immigrant, mostly Jewish, part Irish neighborhood. And these people fought, but they finally got along. Now, black people, Puerto Rican people are moving in, and there's a new kind of snobbery amongst the old inhabitants, and incredible things happen there. I mean, sort of vile and ugly. And in a strange way, it looks like this building will really save the neighborhood from dying, from decaying. There's a new excitement, loud and vulgar, visceral as it is, that shows the excitement of the people in this building. One thing it's taught me, though, is to really examine, the role of the architect. It's so easy to become sort of a masochist martyr working on projects like this. You lose your shirt, and they destroy your work almost before it's finished. I've been told to take pictures the week before the kids move in because it just won't be there 1 week later. And I was telling at dinner tonight how the exterior walls pyramid in. So every classroom has a beautiful skylight that washes the outside wall with light, as in that smaller building. And then there are fast windows that work in at right angles sculpturally. So there's natural light, but the outlook is toward the interior, which is very protected. And in fact, there's a big gate which drops down, which physically keeps kids from going in. But one kid already found a way to destroy the glass. He climbed up on that adjoining apartment house, and before they could catch him, he got away, by the way. He had broken about 12 panes of very expensive zippered-in bronze glass with a BB gun. So there's this element, and you may notice this sort of fuzz. These are layers of mesh, which the contractor put to protect the glass from kids getting in and throwing rocks against it during construction. The inner court, incidentally, will have benches and It has a pattern of light and scored concrete, which isn't revealed here because some of it is still covered with construction paper. And there will be a big contemporary work of sculpture by James Rosati, who's a very good New York sculptor. I had wanted a water wall and fountains and so on, but many exotic ideas got shot down. It has to be sort of a tighter, harder edge in New York. Less joy. Okay? I'm sorry the day was so bleak. Oh, that's interesting. I actually managed to keep the only 3 trees on the site. In fact, unbeknownst to anyone, we designed the whole building around those 3 trees. And I'm very glad now we did. This building is full of interesting spaces. And once again, this thing of how to handle the light. What doesn't show in these pictures is the pattern of artificial lighting. You notice the concrete beams, it's poured concrete, are broken into double beams, and the light always goes between. So when the lights finally go on in this building, it will be a very powerful pattern of light and dark. This is the administration, the central administration hall, which goes up all the way. It took about 4 months of battling to dissuade them. They had abandoned the wood in this, and I had to get it back in. These forms were made in California, fiberglass forms for all the concrete work. I was telling today how the Lathers, who put the reinforcing in New York, it's a very tough subcontract, and these guys are all ex-convicts. And it's appalling what is frozen forever into the concrete work in this building. I've seen bologna sandwiches, Dixie cups, and other things that are sort of unmentionable, but it's all there forever. You'll notice on the detailing of these window walls that I like, even there, to kind of express. Could you go back on that one, please? I mean, rather than, just have great, big, thick old mullions, you may have wondered how we achieve these delicate mullions, and it's simply this way. I show the, on the inside, I express what's resisting the wind pressure and what's carrying the vertical load. And there's a 5-foot module throughout the building, so the glass panes aren't too big for replacement. Okay. And there are many experiences in this building. It's a very difficult one to photograph. This low element on the right is the cafeteria. And it was too dark for me to get a nice picture out, but I think that will be pleasant, being in there and then looking out through a narrow slot of vertical light. This building, I think, will be, on the left, it sort of looks overhuge, but there's a rather interesting gate, like a drawbridge. It has a catenary cable in it, and a huge span. It's about 60 feet long. And I'm waiting until I can catch enough of those little devils directly under it, and I'll see to it that the cables are cut without warning. Here you see what I meant about the richness of the light pattern. And that is a direct outgrowth of the perimeter, which I don't have pictures of, but the classrooms had a stagger to get light in and natural ventilation. The exterior is extremely rich piece of brick sculpture. Oh, here there's some sense of it. This whole project was abandoned for months because of the strike in New York. It was supposed to be open. This is a poorly exposed picture, but it gives you an idea. Those dark slots in the ceiling will be full of light. And this is the sort of detailing on the outside. And there are other rich spaces with concrete and wood. want to go through these pretty fast. This is a small infirmary building that was done for the State University Construction Fund at Cortland, New York. And it faced a waterworks property. And what I did, I made all the infirmary rooms without curtains, so they look into this nice forest. And very simple, bearing wall construction with little delicate precast tees, which span parallel to the perimeter. And the concrete tees were left alone. And this building was incredibly cheap. It came in well below the budget. This is the entry hall. And that's the effect looking out. Hold it. Are you interested in seeing some sort of paintings that is there time for that? You think, Jones? Okay. Hold this 1 minute. Oh, before I show you this, there is my masterwork over there. I finally got a big, responsible job, which I hope throws me into bigger things. The United States Tax Court building in Washington. And that was started in 1965 and is finally underway. And it takes this long sometimes to last a project out. It was abandoned along with the Air Space Museum of Helmuth-Obata Kassebaum because of the Vietnam War. And when they finally had the funds back, in the interim we had lost the site for this rather unusually shaped building. The site has now become the temporary home for the Federal Black College of Washington. And those poor people are going to have to wait about 10 years till they get their building, so there's no way of getting our original site back. And for one solid year last year, it got to the point of seeming hopeless. It's very obvious. The building is over 400 feet long and 120 feet wide, and there aren't too many appropriate sites left in Washington for something like that. I, of course, wanted it in the center of the mall, but they wouldn't. And, well, anyway, about the beginning of this year, we got a site just across the freeway. So our site now is not where you see it there, but right across the freeway. And what we did was rotate the building 180 degrees, and we'll build a beautiful plaza in front of it. So I will just run through those. That's, of course, just a block model. Incidentally, to those students I saw yesterday, this is what I meant about building a block model with just, you know, the significant solids and voids showing. I think it's almost the starting point. This is the sort of thing we do. That large thing you see there, I almost said monster, I'd better not, is the new Department of Labor building. It was commissioned by President Johnson and given to some Texas friends, so I better be careful what I say. And you see the scale of the tax court building. It's rather small and jewel-like. This might be interesting. In the plan, there was a typical judge's suite, which was repeated 32 times, and that was almost what we solved first. We made a beautiful place for 32 judges to be, and we lit it and convinced them and so on. And at the same time, we were leading towards a structural system of shear walls, which are the walls at the ends, concrete, reinforced, bush-hammered concrete shear walls, which will go right through the structure, and there'll be huge precast tees which span the full 40 feet. That's a 10-foot dimension. And once again, even in this building, it will all be left alone, I hope. I'm finding that 32 U.S. tax court judges are pretty formidable when they get together, though, and wear their black robes. And that's, well, this is an early model study, but it's a very, what it is, in a way, is a kind of a 20th century piece of sculpture. The courts are that block. You walk under the courtrooms, up those monumental steps into a public hall, which goes 4.5 stories high with wood detailing. and it's a block that's been exploded apart with air, and that's a 55-foot cantilever. And there are 3 courtrooms there, and each, I haven't told them, but I've designed each one like I designed the early wood chapels. So they'll be holding court in little Sarasota, Florida Lutheran chapels. Now, what I want to tell you is there's more than just architecture. And in what I've done, there have been times in New York where there's no work and everyone's knocking New York and sort of urging you to get away from this ghastly place. But I found that it's a fantastically exciting place in the arts. Some of the greatest artists of the world are there. And it's apparent why, the visual excitement. When I go to get a hamburger, I have 20 visual experiences going and coming. And all of these, I sort of led 3 separate lives. As a painter, at night I would just put on old clothes, and there are places where they let you make a mess, and you work with young people, and no one knows anyone else, nor do they ask. And all of these are really nothing. They're just big sketches in a way, like a sketchbook. I never had more time than I used to do. Well, let's see, this one took like about an hour. I learned all sorts of tricks how to do it. So please don't judge these as final works of art. Why not just flip these right through without pause? These are all big things, too. On some of these, I was learning about stuffing light out of paintings, too, by just allowing a little crack of light. I have one last batch of sculpture. Do you want to see that? Okay. That's my little boy. Oh, just hold this. Sculpture is sort of a recent thing, and I think terribly related. An architect is really a sculptor. There's just no question. And this stone piece, I actually carried that to my office. There was I'm sure I am paid as to do that. And it was a piece of old brownstone from a building they were wrecking in the neighborhood. And the big exercise was just testing the chisel on that thing, and I tried to make an arch, a hole right through this thing without fracturing the whole thing. And it wasn't easy, and that was just an old piece of chestnut that I found, and I tried to make something pleasing with it. These are very, very amateur. I've had more experience drawing, of course, than this, but I must say, this really excites me, and I've had to stop, and I find I miss it. Up there, in that white object, is an idea I have for a skyscraper that I did out of a block of plaster of Paris. Okay. Just show these fast. They're just small things. Now, what I want to do is make buildings like this. Where do you go to do that? Oh, a new guy hired in the office. His first day there, he brought his wife in. I gave him the key to the office, and he came in, and that night when I came back, he had broken this piece. It's incredible. I never fired him. It was very tiny. It's in pieces now. This is sort of my favorite. Now, I have to confess, when on my trip down the Grand Canyon, I came across some vertebrae of wild burrow, these marvelous little bones, and just as an exercise to sort of keep my eye true or something, I just simply copied it in clay. And this is simply a clay copy of a little vertebrae. Is that it? Thank you very much.